Working on it.
So I'm probably gonna be sitting down when I'm doing this, just so I can hit the buttons and everything. So I don't want you to think I'm being rude and putting my back to it. But just for a little bit of background, in all honesty, until a couple of years ago, I didn't even realize that there was such a thing as the United States Life-Saving Service.
Can you hear it? I don't know.
What happened was there was a persistent group of people in Kittery, where I live, who were working really hard to save this broken down, old, dilapidated building on Wood Island that they insisted had historical significance. And I was curious as to why this was such a big deal for them. And come to find out,
Okay.
this was a station that was used by the United States Life-Saving Service, which was a predecessor of the Coast Guard. Back in 1915, this agency combined with the Revenue Cutter Service to form what we know today as the Coast Guard. So this is what first got me aware of the Life-Saving Service. But these guys, this picture is the one that really got me fascinated. And it just so happens that this is the Wallace Sands crew back right around 1900. And I saw this picture. I mean, look at those faces, right? I saw that picture and I was like, you know what? There's going to be some stories here. And what they're wearing are their sort of iconic court vests that they would wear when they would go out on their rescue missions. Now, apparently, a lot of you probably already know this picture because it's on the cover of your the historical book that was put out by Arcadia Publishing. Apparently, we don't know who goes to what, but within this picture is Captain Selden Wells, John Pridham, Horace Berry, Ben Ricker, and Thomas Barrow. And I'm dying to find out which one of these is Captain Wells, because he turned out to be kind of an interesting character. Now, to get into the story of the Surfmen, we actually have to start with this guy who emphatically was not a surfman. He was a clerk. But he's from Maine, so I have to make sure to give him his props. Sumner Kimball was born in Lebanon, raised in Sanford, and graduated from Bowdoin College. He was a lawyer and he did a short stint in the Maine legislature. And then he wound up going to the Treasury Department as a clerk. And he was very organized, very detailed, very professional, and very efficient. And he was charged with reviewing what was in place then. So before the life-saving service began, there were life-saving stations along the coast, but they weren't organized. They were, run locally. They weren't very well equipped. The equipment they did have was in pretty rough shape. Sumner Kimball was the one who did the top to bottom review, figured out what needed to be done and how to implement it. So he was made the first and only general superintendent in charge for the life-saving service. He got the post in 1878 when they officially established it. And he remained that position until 1915 when they finally merged it into the Coast Guard with the Revenue Cutter Service. Oh, and the big thing about this guy is he was a bureaucrat with a genius for public relations. regulations. What he did, very ingeniously to, because obviously, you always needed budget, the budget to support the service and keep it going. And you got to remember that back in these days, so late 1800s, everything is through the written word. We don't have radio, we don't have television, we don't have cell phones, we don't have the internet. Everything is through communicated through newspapers and periodicals, magazines, and art, sketches. And he made a point of emphasizing, the drama and the more glamorous aspect of what these guys did. And this actually gives you a good idea of the image that he was kind of trying to portray. So these guys, what they would do in the absolute worst weather conditions you can imagine, when the rest of us were, hunkering down and just wanting to stay warm and dry, these guys would push off in their wooden rowboats and head out to aid mariners in distress on nearby shipwrecks. And their motto was, you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. Not exactly great recruiting tool, I would think. Whoops. Okay, so it's just some background. So again, with Kimball's encouragement, the news accounts would refer to these guys as storm warriors. Help present that notion that he wanted to portray. The men who made up the crews of the life-saving stations obviously tended to be men of the sea. They were fishermen and dock workers, shipyard workers, and a lot of times they tended to be generational. You'd have sons following fathers into the service. The pay wasn't great back in the early days. It was $40 a month. Eventually, they hiked it up to $65. And there wasn't much in the way of disability or benefits, but it was a steady paycheck, which, in rough times, especially for those like in the fishing community, steady paycheck wasn't always easy to come by.
What island I did all of this, but
there were some who died on duty, while trying to rescue others, but many more were lost to disease. I mean, think about it. You're out there in these horrible winter conditions, because that's when most of these wrecks occurred. We're during the cold weather months. You're out there in the cold and the wet rescuing these people. Then you're going back to your stations, which were not exactly, the Paris Hilton. Actually, there was a guy who was the head guy, the head keeper in Jerry's Point in Rye. He wound up, the guy in charge, he wound up dying from illness they contracted doing the job. So what these guys would do is they would run beach patrols. So from their station, they would fan out and walk the beaches, to watch, look out over the sea, watch for shipwrecks and people in distress. And then at their stations, they would have towers to watch out from as well. And they were constantly training in order to shorten the rescue time. And one of their major tools was the Lyle gun, which is basically like a mortar cannon that was used to shoot out the rescue line over the shipwreck. And then that line would be used to either haul in the people who were stranded, or to set up the breeches buoy pulley system, which is this. So basically,
Homer.
so they would shoot the line, and then hook up the pulley system here.
Yeah.
This buoy, it's got the breeches here, that's the pants, so you would put your legs through it, and then they would use that to haul you to safety. this painting here is a Winslow Homer painting, showing the breeches buoy being used. And you notice something about that painting that I love is you don't see the guy's face. The focus, you know, you've got the woman who's being rescued and the guy, you know, the surfman who's rescuing her, but you can't see his face, which I love because he's basically, you know, the everyman, you know, he's representing all the surfmen who were, this was their goal. So as you know, New Hampshire does not have the longest coastline, but look how well protected they were. You had stations at Hampton Beach, Rye Beach, Wallace Sands. Then you had the one at Jerry's Point in Newcastle. And then you also had one eventually out at the Isles of Shoals. And then at one point in 1908, the one in Newcastle was shut down and moved over to Wood Island. And that's how that Wood Island station came about over in Kittery. And these are what the stations look like. So down here at the bottom, in the right corner, that's the one at Jerry's, that's Jerry's Point Station in Newcastle. And then going up clockwise, you've got Hampton Beach. Then you've got the Rye Beach, and then up top is the Wallace Sands Station. Now, again, I don't know who this fellow is, but I thought it was a good shot of what they looked like back then. This was he was part of the Rye Beach crew. And this is one of a whole bunch of really cool enlarged photos that are hanging up at Atlantic Grill. But this gives you an idea of the, kind of puts a face on the service. Okay, so this is the good stuff. So George S. Wasson was another famous maritime painter and novelist. He's more, Winslow Homer was like an international figure. George Wasson was more of a Seacoast guy. They actually just had a very cool exhibit about him over at the Portsmouth Athenaeum that just ended last month.
Wasson.
So sort of a fortuitous thing happened. Well, fortuitous for all except one particular fellow. But in November of 1888, the Jerry's Point station had just been established like the year before. And November of 88, there was this terrible nor'easter that came through. And the Jerry's Point crowd was called out to rescue the crew. And this wound up being a very, very well-known and dramatic rescue. The official report later said, every man in this crew, referring to the life-saving crew, came within an ace of losing his life from the keeper down. So that while they were doing their utmost to save the crew of the wreck, they were in turn saving the lives of each other. So each member of that life-saving crew wound up earning the gold life-saving medal, which is basically like their Medal of Honor. So what happened was the dyer was hauling coal and it anchored during this very terrible nor'easter, freezing weather. And the storm carried the ship in, broke the anchor chain. It was pulling it in toward the rocky shore. So they didn't, the crew of the Jerry's Point didn't have time to break out the rescue ship, the rescue boat or anything like that. So what they had to do was they had to go out onto these slippery rocks to rescue these men in the surf. Two of the guys on the ship wound up jumping into the water. So they had to be fished out by the surfmen. And two others had to be hauled in to that line. So they shot the line, wrapped it around them, and then had to be hauled in. But again, you know, at one point, Silas Harding was washed from a rock and had to be rescued by George Randall, one of the surfmen, who in turn was later rescued by Winslow Amazine. And later, both Randall and Amazine had to be, quote, I love this, dragged almost lifeless from the seething smother by their fellow surfmen. That's one of those official reports that they like to dramatize quite a bit. And then later on, another one of the surfmen was hauling a crew of the boat, a crew member from the boat to safety when a huge breaker came over, washed the both of them off the rock. And it just so happened that they were washed over into the inland side of the rock, which was fortuitous because if they'd been on the other side, they would have been sucked out into the undertow and both drowned. So again, each one of these, the crewmen were given the gold life-saving medal. This on the right is the letter that was sent to, in this case, Winslow Amazine from the Secretary of the Treasury, that came with the medal recognizing their heroism. And again, this was, you know, the highest award that a surfman could win.
So only one person was lost on that?
Yeah, there were 4 that were rescued. The one who was lost, they had climbed up into the rigging and a wave came, and this guy was 40 feet over into the air. Wave came and it washed him out to sea, and his body was never found. But miraculously, they were able to save the other 4. And again, that, you know, not fortuitous for the guy who drowned, but the timing was pretty impeccable for the life-saving service, especially locally, where the station had just gone up. And the Portsmouth Daily Chronicle, which was the paper at the time, reported that nearly 200 lives were saved by surfmen all along the Atlantic coast during that particular storm. And they had this statement: the country owes a debt of lasting gratitude to Mr. Sumner Kimball, the present chief and founder of this humane work, for the splendid results of his hard labor. The good accomplished in these 2 days more than pays for all the money required to keep the service in operation. So this really established the importance and necessity of having this agency and having these stations in the area.
What did the Treasury Department?
For a long time, well, this was under their department, was the Treasury. So I've got this theory that that history, people are most drawn to history when you're able to put like names and faces to it. This particular guy was Captain Silas Harding. So each station had a crew of about roughly 7 members. And the head of each station was referred to as the keeper. And when referred to, he was referred to as captain, like as you would the captain of a ship. This particular gentleman, Silas Harding, was the keeper of the Jerry's Point station when, at the time of the Oliver Dyer rescue. And he remained there until 1896, when he was promoted to serve as the superintendent for all of district, the first district, which is all of Maine and New Hampshire, so about 15 stations in all. The keepers especially tended to be like sort of pillars of the community, you know, the way like a police chief or fire chief might be. This particular gentleman, he was also like one of the first trustees of the library over in Newcastle, part of the temperance, one of the leaders of the temperance division. And he lived to be 86. And a local historian at the time said Harding's example in life was to show what a true surfman could do. This is another interesting fellow. Captain Hand, he wound up serving 30 years in the life-saving service and continued on even after it became part of the Coast Guard. And he served a couple of different terms as the keeper over at the Wood Island, or well, Jerry's Point, and Wood Island, and then also later at the Isles of Shoals. So he joined in 1901 and he eventually retired. And then in 1942, when we got into the Second World War, he was brought back into, there were news accounts of him being brought back into the service. And at this point, he was like 65. But he was, you know, he was such a well-known and valued member of the seafaring community that they, you know, they wanted to have him there in the post, which was right here in the Seacoast. Now, there was a particular incident in May of 1920. Captain Hand was out at Wood Island with his crew, and they happened to see a boat out in the Piscataqua River who capsized by a squall. And they went out to, so he and his crew headed out to the site to rescue them. When they got there, only two of the men on the boat were still floating. There had been 4 on board, and they also turned out to be surfmen who were out at the Isles of Shoals. They would come into Portsmouth for a supply run. They were on their way back when a squall came and capsized the boat. Only one of the 2 that they found survived. The other one that they found was found floating face deep in the water. That was Sherman Parker. And this is Sherman Parker. So Sherman Parker was only 20 years old when he died in that incident as a member of what was then the Coast Guard. But before that, he had served in France during World War I. And the newspaper accounts, you know, that were describing, you know, the incident there in the Piscataqua, they noted his splendid war record. What he did was, I don't know how much you folks know about World War I. That's the one where it was basically literally fought in the trenches. So you had, you know, one army entrenched on one side, one army entrenched on the other. Sherman's job was he manned the mule team that carried ammunition and supplies to the front lines during, you know, mud, rain, and shelling, and so forth. And he survived really several close encounters, including one incident where both of his mules got blown up right in front of him. So he survived all that, came home from the war, and he joined the Coast Guard. Again, following in the footsteps of his father, Alonzo, who was a surfman up at Cape Elizabeth. And also in the footsteps of his father-in-law, who was Charles Hand. So when he went out to the capsized boat, his son-in-law was the one they found that didn't make it. They'd only been married 6 months. He died, and Ada was a widow at 18. So the folks at Wood Island told me about this story, which I thought was pretty fascinating. But it bugged me that we didn't have any pictures of any of these characters, and I was curious as to what happened with Ada, the young 18-year-old widow, because there was really not that much of a mention of her in the papers. So I went ahead and wrote this story in the Herald. And then about a week later, I did a PowerPoint presentation like this over Newcastle. And at one point, I can't remember if it was before or after, this burly gentleman came up to me with this thick binder. He said, "Hey, I really want to thank you for that article you wrote about my family." And I didn't know what he was talking about. He said, my grandfather was Sherman Parker. My great-grandfather was Charles Hand. What I didn't even know when I first wrote that story is that young Ada was pregnant. And so the guy that came up to me, his name was John Connors. And John's mother, Mary, was born just a few months after Sherman died.
That John, police officer that passed away a few years ago.
That is indeed him. And that's him as a youngster. So on the left, so that's him in the front. On the left is our left is his mother, Mary, that was born after Sherman died. And then that's Ada, who was Sherman's widow. And then on the right is Charles Hand's widow, Clara. And then John Connors, who just really sweethearted guy. In that binder. So he had all these pictures of Charles Hand, like of his entire career, all these documents and everything, which he wound up donating to the Wood Island guys, folks. But when I met him, he didn't know about his grandfather's service in World War I. He didn't know that his body had been recovered. He thought it had been lost at sea, but he was actually buried up in Maine. And he'd never seen a picture of his grandfather. And then John actually died January of last year. And afterwards, his sister came across this picture. I'm sorry, not this one, the one of this one here of Sherman and his wife. Okay. So this is the Lizzie car, which I think some of you might be familiar with. So here's the thing about the Lizzie car, about this particular incident is, so basically the Lizzie car, again, it was a schooner, sailing along the Seacoast. It was carrying timber. This one had a crew of 7. And it wound up it was sailing during hurricane winds, and it wound up crashing on the rocks right near Parsons Point. And so the ship's crew had to lash themselves to the rigging to avoid being, swept overboard. And then when the vessel slammed into the rocks, the mast came down. The skipper was thrown overboard, and the Wallace Sands crew tried to use that Lyle gun to shoot over the rescue line. And I made a few attempts, and it wasn't working. Excuse me. And again, one of those official reports on the incident says the life-saving crew, in attempting to reach the wreck, were swept back each time and cast upon the beach. For a time, it looked like the shipwrecked men were doomed. So what you had was, so you had these raging, storming seas, smashing the ship to bits, which was also carrying timber. So as these men were trying to push through the surf to get out to the wrecked ship, you've got these basically wooden missiles, like torpedoes, coming at you, in addition to, you know, trying to avoid the waves and so forth. But the cool thing about this particular incident is that it brought together what I like to think of as the sort of the local surfmen version of the 1927 Yankees. Because, so you remember Silas Harding. So at this point, so it's 1905 now. So it's about 17 years after the Oliver Dyer. And now he's the guy that's in charge of, you know, the entire state of Maine, the entire state of New Hampshire. But he's still living in Newcastle, right next door. So he winds up coming to the scene. At the other end was Charles Hand. So we know that he went on to have this very illustrious career, but in 1905, he'd only been a surfman for 4 years, but he was part of the Jerry's Point crew at Newcastle. And they wound up coming down to help out with the Lizzie Carr. But in addition to that, the keeper of the Wallace Sands crew was Selden Wells, who had also been part of that Oliver Dyer rescue 17 years before. And shortly after that, he was made the keeper at Wallace Sands. And he'd been the keeper since 1890. In addition to that, you had the Ephraim Hall, who was the keeper of the Jerry's Point station. Ephraim Hall, you'll remember, had also been part of the Oliver Dyer rescue crew. And now he was running his own station down at Jerry's Point. In fact, he was the one who was in charge when Jerry's Point made the transition over to Wood Island. Then he was also in charge there when they made the transition from the life-saving service to the Coast Guard. So basically, and then you had Captain Remick, who was the keeper of the Wright Beach station, who was you know, a pretty formidable guy in his own right. So fortunately, he had a ton of experience there. And not only, you figure, Silas Harding was not only, as the district superintendent, not only was he the, you know, the superior of these other keepers, he was their old skipper too. So it kind of felt the reason that once he showed up, he pretty much took charge. So what they did was they combined the crews that were gathered there and put them into one boat, and then together, they just by, well, you saw that picture of what these guys look like, just by their brute, you know, force and you know, power of will, they pushed the boat out past beyond the surf, out to the shipwrecked Leslie Carr. And then, and again, referring to those reports, the crew came across the 6 drenched crewmen, quote, limp and alert, clinging to the top of the deck house, which was jumping about like a living thing in the huge wash of the sea. You'll remember that there had been 7 guys. The first mate decided that he was going to swim for it, and he was never seen or heard from again. So they managed to get out there, got these seamen onto their boat, and then made their way back to back to the shore, and then the guys on the shore waited out, and again, you gotta remember, not only do you have these crashing waves you're fighting against, you've got these, these wooden missiles that are coming at you from every angle. They waited out to help guide the boat back in, and again, out of the 7-man crew, they managed to rescue 6 of them. And again, some of you folks probably know this better than anybody, but according to legend, parts of the Lizzie Carr shipwreck and some of the timber that was found, washed up, was used to build some of the local homes here in the area. Part of the hull of the Lizzie Carr is still on display at the Seacoast Science Center after it was excavated. Actually, by an old professor of mine, David Switzer, up at Plymouth State College, came in and excavated it after it was found on the beach back in the early 2000s. And for a time, the ship's wheel was located over at the Brighton Museum. Now, Captain, and again, for the local tie there, Captain Wells, he was the one who was the keeper at the Wallace Sands Station. He was in charge there for almost 30 years. He retired in August of 1919, right after he turned 65, and died less than a year later, the following July, cancer of the upper jaw. And after he died, the Portsmouth Herald ran an editorial where they were saying, among other things, to thousands of summer visitors and tourists, he was the hardy lifesaver and guardian of several miles of our treacherous seacoast. He displayed rare courage in time of danger and leading brave lads into perilous work, and won for himself the title of hero on more than one occasion. He loved his work, and his station was one of the best kept on the entire Atlantic seacoast. His death will be mourned by many from near and far. And at his funeral service, one of his pallbearers was none other than Charles Hand. As far as the Rye Beach station, that ceased operating right around 1933, and the Wallace Sand Station closed around 1938. And this is what used to be the Wallace Sand Station. Now it's known as the Surf Club. Are there any members of the Surf Club? Okay, good, I can say this. They're quite exclusive. I went poking around there, and I got all kinds of looks like, what is this kind of doing? But it's just funny to me that this station, with all these salty, rugged, grubby guys, who were committed to life saving. Now it's for a.
Before that, it was the Pirates Cove.
Yes, it was. For many years, I guess. And before that, it was another restaurant that I think called Wallace Sands Restaurant.
Oh, yeah, before that. Oh, what was the name of it? Oh my gosh. Sam's restaurant. Oh my gosh. Great views, terrible food.
Maybe that's why they're not open anymore.
So I have a question. There is still some remnants of a ship at Pirates Cove. Is that part of the Lizzie Carr?
Yeah. Apparently, when the winds hit just right and the waters wash away, you can still see parts of it that they weren't able to dig up. So it just has never gone away. But anyway, so this is the Wood Island Station now. You saw what it looked like at the beginning. It's always a work in progress. And part of the goal is that they're going to establish a maritime museum there. That's going to, continue, carrying on the story of the Surfmen. So basically, so the Wood Island the Wood Island Station wound up being closed after World War II. When the Coast Guard decided to return back to Newcastle, which is where the Coast Guard Station is now. And, and obviously by that time, we were more into motorized vessels and things like that. So there wasn't really perceived need to have so many stations nearby, that were counting on, wooden rowboats, to get out to these people in distress. But that's what I got.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Allan, how many stations were there at the heyday of the life-saving service? And how far south did they
Oh, you mean all total?
go? Yeah,
Oh, there was like more than 100. Yeah, they had them on the Atlantic, they had them on the Atlantic coast, the Pacific coast, and they also had them at the Great Lakes. That was what, as you can imagine, that gets just as treacherous as the Seacoast around here.
and is Wood Island the only surviving building?
Very few, there are very few, and one thing that they're very proud of at the Wood Island one is there's a marine railway. Yeah, you guys know when I get started. So they've got this marine railway that shoots down from the building into the water. Okay, so someday they're going to be, and they've got a couple of boats that they've restored, or a couple that they built from scratch as well. But someday they're hoping that when visitors come out, they'll be able to ride this boat as it shoots down the marine railway into the water. So I'm definitely going to be on that. But that's the thing, again, at the very beginning, because remember, we're talking about late 1800s, we're talking, wooden rowboats that you're pushing out by hand, but as time went by, they had, other innovations like the marine railway, which is definitely a much more fun and efficient way to get out into the water than, pushing it out in the middle of a storm. I don't know how these guys do it. Are there any Coast Guard guys here? Okay, good. So anyone who's been in the service knows that there's like this kind of friendly, brotherly rivalry between the different branches. Deep down, no one's ever going to admit this, but deep down, each branch respects what the others does. Having said that, when I was in the Navy, we used to call the Coast Guard the knee-deep Navy. But we also recognize, they do like amazing things, in terms of rescuing and law enforcement and all that. So they
Dawn.
do amazing stuff.
Dawn, it's Alex over here.
Oh,
I have to thank Dawn because the favor he did for me, we were going back and forth and loaded the book of the account of the Lizzie Kerr from the U.S. Lifesaving Service, but I actually created a document, it's growing, of course, on the history of the lifesaving service in Rye, but it was because of that interaction with you, and I ultimately sent that to you, but there's obviously a lot more we can add to it. I just wanted to add a few things that came about because I had to cut and paste it from the draft of my new book, but I read somewhere that in the late 1860s, around the world, we were losing over 2,000 ships a year due to weather. The British merchant fleet lost almost 1,000 in 1853. It just gives you a sense of why we needed this in 1871. Now, I think you all know the building I'm about to talk about. It's been on the front cover of Stroll magazine. I mean, it's a fabulous building. But that 1871 life-saving station in Rye, of course, is still there. And it was replaced by the one larger, closer to Lock's Neck. But you go down to that off Old Beach Road, and you go down to that first, the end of that first beach access road, and there it is. When you look at the front of it, you turn your back to the ocean, say, oh my God, yeah, that's not a house. So that has been a private home ever since it was replaced by the larger one. And you made reference to them. They were both destroyed and demolished in the 30s. So there's a great story. And you know what, we learn all of this stuff. Thank God for historic newspaper archives. We wouldn't know this stuff because they're the only ones who reported it. So here's one story. People were so upset in Rye and other places that they no longer had these life-saving stations. One at Wallace Sands and one there just below Lock's Neck. They were closed down. And they said, that Coast Guard station boat in Hampton Beach is never going to get here in time. So people on Rye Beach raised money for 2 specially designed dory rescue vessels. And these actually had motors on them too, so you didn't have to row them out. And there again, you'd have to go through the newspapers to find out if they were ever used. But there was one occasion where somebody was about to drown on Great Bay. And the Portsmouth police chief knew that Rye had these kind of boats. So we called Manning Remick, who was the Rye police chief. And Manning's out living out there on Lock's Neck. He hooked up that surf boat. And in 10 minutes, he drove to Great Bay. Well, I think you can visualize that route, you know, out Ocean Road, you know, he was flying. And they rescued that guy who couldn't swim off an ice floe in Great Bay. So that was one great story. But the people were really upset, and you can understand that. And the final little anecdote, of course, is at Rye Harbor, the port of missing men. And all the kids used to gather down there with the old timers on the south side of the harbor. And they too were upset because, you know, we lost our life-saving station. And there was still huge storms and still people being lost at sea. And so it's an incredible history, and there's a lot more to be learned about. But I love the human dimension you gave us, so I appreciate that.
So Alex and Don, I will add a little bit to your story, Alex, in that those boats, and I can't say for sure, but I can remember as a kid living here in town in the 40s. Now I was born in 1950, but I can remember going with my father down to, I don't know if it was Frost Beach or Wallace Sands or someplace. He was a sign painter. And he would, every spring, he would re-letter a boat or several boats in Rye that were used for life saving.
That's right.
I don't know if I have any pictures, but you know, I'll look and see if I can find any pictures. But he would, because he was a sign painter, they would hire him to re-letter the boats.
Well, I think what we went back to is what Dawn was telling us, what we had before 1871, this informal service, because people know those Coast Guard boats are too far away. We need to do this. One last thing I wanted to ask you, because this is just from photos at the museum. I believe we have a photo of the Wallace Sands Life-Saving Station, and it is not located where the surf club is. It is much closer to the north end of Prospect Point. In fact, rather close to where the Lizzie car wrecked, because you can see it in the background. So I don't know where you found that information, but I think the picture shows that in fact, it wasn't there. It was much further south, near where the shipwreck happened. But you know, all of this stuff is living history and we keep learning, so.